Hello there, I'm K-Ball, and welcome to Human Skills, where I interview tech industry leaders about all the non technical skills that go into success in the tech industry. Being a manager can feel incredibly contrived and awkward, especially when you're managing people who are more experienced or older than you are. But at the root of it, you're still human, and so are the people you're managing. What it stood out to me most about this interview with Miriam Connor is her continual focus on the humanity of our situations at work. How leading a team is like being a party host, how becoming a new manager requires getting comfortable with letting people struggle, and the importance of kindness and treating people with respect. Miriam, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah. So, to start out, why don't you share a little bit about you and your background and kind of what your career journey has looked like and anything in there that made you start to take notice of these things that we're calling human skills and
hmm
consider them more important?
Yeah, so my background's kind of interesting because I was actually a linguistics major in college. I was and still am someone who is interested a little bit in everything, had a very hard time picking a major. Eventually chose linguistics just because I took one class and was like, this is rad, this is so much fun, and there's so much to dive into here. And conveniently, it was a pretty lightweight major in terms of the number of credits you needed to get. So there was a lot of time to take lots of other classes. And in my exploration, I also ended up taking computer science. And at first was like, okay, this is like to fill the requirement for a minor that I'm doing. And then I thought more, I was like, this is much more fun than the minor. I was doing an electrical engineering minor and a linguistics major because that's a very useful combo. um, and started to realize that there were interesting connections between language and computers, and that there was actually a growing industry that wanted to hire people who knew how to work with both. So I got my master's degree in a program at Stanford called Symbolic Systems, which is kind of a blend of technology and linguistics and philosophy and psychology. But I was really focused on natural language processing, which is a field that's very top of mind for a lot of people now because of ChatGPT and similar models, but
Mm-hmm.
was wasn't quite there yet when I got into it. So I was at Google for almost 6 years, about 3 years in Google research, working on these natural language processing query understanding applications. 3 years on the Google Assistant, kind of doing similar stuff, but with more of a product lens. And then after I'd been at Google for a while, I decided it was time for a change, and I started at a company called Humu, which is where I met Kevin and kind of started doing a bit of everything. I mean, from data pipelines to web app development and a lot of management. And I think people skills have been something I'm interested in from the beginning. I think, a lot of what I was interested in linguistics was sociolinguistics and how people use language to do things and create social norms and constructs and sort of show their identities and who they are. So I've always been really interested in how people work together and communicate. I think I could have also been, a very happy psychology major or sociology major, but there wasn't time to study everything. Um, and so I think there's that. I think also being a woman in tech, you are almost forced to think a lot about those interpersonal skills because you're sometimes navigating tricky situations and how you show up and appear to people. So on the one hand, you want people to take you seriously. On the other hand, you want to be reasonably likable. And on the third hand, you also kind of don't want to worry about any of that stuff and you just want to be yourself. And so kind of crafting that balance of how you're interacting with people and maybe even trying to change some of the norms that you're in means that you're focused a lot on the people skills.
Yeah. I'd love to dig in a little bit actually on sociolinguistics and this idea of the way that people use language to craft cultures and environments. How have you seen that, or can you share some examples of how that plays out, for example, in a tech company?
Yeah, well, one example that I think is kind of maybe a little bit funnier, but at Google, there was Google's big enough that you can really get these subcultures. And there was a real divide in usage of certain terms, I think chiefly between engineering, especially kind of like people on the more IC side, and product management slash of other leadership. And there was this big kind of internal meme-based debate on the internal meme site, MemeGen, about the words ask and learning being used in their non-standard part of speech. So instead of saying we asked them for something, we said we went to them with this ask. And then instead of saying I learned something, it's like we got these learnings versus lessons or requests. And I think those were just sort of, terms of common parlance among product managers, and being kind of against using those terms because you believed other terms existed or those terms were really had a different meaning, was sort of a stance you could take across different parts of the company, but I think especially in engineering as a bit of this wedge, like, oh, the product managers, they're the ones, they're just kind of talking, making up words, coming up with things for us to do, and we're kind of the down to earth, using words normally, actually doing the stuff people. And for me, this was interesting to observe because, one, I think there's kind of two things going on. One is that you can use jargon to kind of create an in-group. So using ask and learnings, I didn't, go study it, but it could be used to kind of create a product manager, leadership in-group where you have this certain way of speaking that's very kind of businessy and shows that you're kind of really deep in the business. And then on the other hand, it's pretty normal for words to get new meanings, and to, especially in English, to cross part of speech boundaries from noun to verb and verb to noun. And it's another way to build identity, to be recalcitrant against those changes. You'll see, you see a lot of this in opinion pieces about, well, I respect non-binary people, but I think it's really annoying to have to use they, them as the pronouns. Okay, well, the they, them already has this other meaning. Okay, well, I think there were attempts to create other gender-neutral pronouns that just didn't work, so you probably didn't like those either because it was another new thing. So that was just interesting to observe at Google. I was kind of the opinion that just let people talk. Like, we know what each other means, so let's just move forward. But you really do get interesting social dynamics around language use.
Yeah, well, and I think sometimes it can get to the point where different in-groups mean completely different things when they say particular words.
Yeah. That's another one that I've encountered, and it's less, about in-groups purposefully separating themselves from each other and more about different backgrounds. So, at Google, I worked with a lot of linguists who often had a PhD in linguistics, and also a lot of engineers who had no background in linguistics, and we were trying to kind of agree on terminology and models for annotating text that would become training data. And there was this just vocabulary divide. So on the engineering side, we had things that we called entities, and we had things that we called intents. These were kind of broad categories of things that may or may not be kind of in maybe a philosophy or linguistics or psychological setting called those things. And so there's kind of this constant back and forth, like, well, that's not an intent. Well, I know, but in the code it is. And so we all call it that, and we don't want to change everything. So that's always kind of been an interesting role for me to play as someone who has background both in social science and engineering and has kind of like witnessed the movement between sort of those two fields and sort of the attempt to align vocabulary. We had also a lot of that to figure out at Humu when we were writing nudges and trying to annotate nudges in different ways. And there's all this deep and very technical organizational psychology and industrial psychology with all these terms about different types of jobs and different types of, in behavioral science, different types of interventions. And we kind of had to flatten that a little bit so that engineers and salespeople and the rest of the company could actually work with it. But that also kind of breeds confusion as soon as you change terminology.
Totally. Well, and so I'm curious, as someone who has formed that bridge role, what tactics tongue talking outside of it. What tactics do you tend to use when you notice there's a gap where people are sort of talking past each other or misaligned on the meanings of words? How do you bring them together?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing is going in with the mindset that this is probably going to happen, because two groups of people know two very different groups of things. And one thing that I've seen a lot is that engineers kind of like to understand things from first principles or develop their own first principles, and come up kind of with their own mental models. And it can be based on sort of what they've heard from other experts, but they're trying to, in engineering, you have to kind of grasp it yourself and come to your own understanding of it so you can work with it. But kind of in that process, engineers will come up with their own concepts and terms, or maybe things that are well studied and understood and have a different concept or term in an existing field of study. So I think, first of all, I just go in with the assumption that this is going to happen. So what we're just looking for is where. And then a lot of the time, what I try to do is I'm listening. If I see this happening where it usually just means like some question just keeps coming up, or some debate just keeps being unsettled meeting after meeting, and you start to think maybe people just don't really understand what we're talking about, because I don't think this is actually the kind of thing that requires this much debate. And what I usually try to do is restate for either one party or both parties what I think they mean when they're saying something. So I'm trying to think of an example, but all the examples are like a little bit obscure. I mean, I remember this coming up a lot in nudge tagging. I think one thing that we were trying to do is we're trying to send the appropriate nudge. It's like this, behavior science-based tip for how you can kind of improve at your job, improve at building a good team culture, improve at communication, etc. We wanted to send one that's appropriate based on what your job is. And if your job is in retail, the types of tips that are appropriate for your work are kind of different if you're an executive salesperson. Maybe you're both trying to sell things, but maybe in retail, it's not appropriate to say, next time you drop by your coworker's desk, blah, 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 because your coworker doesn't have a desk, or maybe you're actually usually alone. So we wanted to develop these tags so we could label the nudges with who they were appropriate to send to. And in industrial organizational psychology, and I'm probably going to get this wrong, I'm just going to describe the types of things that exist. There's both kind of these job archetypes that you know about, like individual retail person or retail manager at maybe even like to the degree of like at a clothing store or in a food service setting, or executive leader in sales or sales manager, all these different kind of understood job titles. But those are kind of compositions of different features of a job. So someone who is an individual contributor in retail, they're not a manager. They work face-to-face with customers. They don't have a desk. They usually work hourly shifts. They usually don't have a lot of control over their own schedule or even what their set of responsibilities is, versus a retail manager might have a lot of similar attributes, but maybe they have more flexibility in determining their own working schedule, maybe not. Maybe they have more flexibility in determining their responsibilities, maybe not. They also have responsibility for other people. So they're kind of this buildup of atomic features. And these like job characteristics or attributes versus job titles thing is, I think that was a place where there was a little bit of confusion, because the engineer were just like, what do we need to label this with? This is a nudge for, you wrote it for someone in retail, we're just label it with retail. But, on the behavior science side, they're saying, well, we wrote it for retail. It's also appropriate for these other areas. So what we'd like to label it with is this more fine-grained thing. And then on the engineering side, we're like, we don't want to deal with all these there's too many labels. We can't really like handle it yet.
Right,
And so
right.
it just comes to like agreeing, okay, we would like to label this with the fine grained characteristics. That's maybe not a reasonable first step because it's just a lot of work. So we're going to label it with these job title based features that are kind of more an agglomerate of characteristics. And then maybe in the future, we can like kind of add these finer grain labels and deprecate the old ones. But it required everyone understanding this kind of like complex landscape of different ways you can tag something and agreeing that we were on the engineering side going to do the thing that wasn't perfect on the psychological side, but we all understood why.
Yeah. So I like that example because you're basically trying to take what I would describe as a schema design that is in their head.
Mm-hmm.
And
Right.
they have both the normalized version of this schema, which is the job attributes, and they have the smashed, or like the, what's that called? The projections or the compositions.
Mm-hmm.
And what I'm gathering from this and what I also vaguely remember is when we first were having those conversations, there was not agreement on both sides that both of these things were schemas that existed. There was
Mm-hmm.
confusion about, wait, why are you saying one thing versus the other, and not this idea that, oh, there's a normalized version of this, there's a useful, already composed, flattened version of this,
Mm-hmm.
and those are two valid ways of looking at the world.
Right. And there's different, from an implementation perspective, there's different pros and cons to doing each one. And the main con to going with a really fine grained thing is that then we have to maintain all these characteristics and we also have to label everything. And that just takes a really long time. And we already kind of knew that what was for retail and what was for food service. So it's easier just to do those basic labels and get things moving.
Yeah. Well, and that gets to kind of an interesting area of trade-offs when you're making technical decisions about, how do you make decisions about the right level of detail, about the right, I think a lot of times we as engineers think, oh, there's a right solution. I want to put
Mm-hmm.
in the time to get to the right solution. But the right technical solution may not always be the right business or human solution.
Yeah. I often think about how long is it going to be until having done the right solution really matters. If it's in 2 months, probably good to do the right solution. But sort of the further in the future it is, the further it's like, oh, well, eventually we're going to have, let me try to think of some example, not maybe using Humu's IP. Say it's like in the future, we think we'll have maybe 1 billion users on this platform, and we'll need to decompose these things into services to handle all this traffic. And we need to have all these different APIs between the microservices, and we need to have all these like backups to make sure that everything stays live. But in the next month, we really only expect maximum of 2,000 users. And it's maybe 5 years, if we're lucky, before we have 1 billion users. Well, then the farther out the thing you're building for is in the future, the more imaginary it is. And the less likelihood there is that it's actually going to happen. And so, I mean, anyone who's tried to like tell a product manager when a project is going to be done knows that predicting the future is hard. But you can predict it okay in 2 weeks and like okay in 2 months, and like you can kind of get together what you think might happen in the next year. Especially, I mean, and if you're a Google, you might have enough data and have to kind of lock in because you have to coordinate enough people that you need to think about what's going to happen in 3 years. That's like kind of a reasonable prediction horizon. But especially for a startup, every year is like completely different. So I think you just weigh like how imaginary is this thing that I'm trying to build for? Does it really exist in a meaningful way outside of my mind? Can I be even confident it'll ever happen? And how much, based on sort of that like likelihood it's going to happen and the amount of work it's going to be and cost if we don't build for that and then it happens, how much am I willing to kind of sacrifice right now to prepare for that? So is it okay to push back the launch by a month? maybe not. But I think not like writing down 20% chance that we get a billion users, but kind of being a little bit quantitative about these things, or at least kind of breaking down the things that you're weighing helps a lot, I think, to make those decisions. And I think for a startup, it's a little better. It's better to bias at least a little bit for the now, not entirely for the now, but you do not know what the state of your startup's going to be in 3 months.
Totally. All right, coming back to a slightly different topic. You, like I, came to the software industry not from a computer science degree program. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a tremendous number of folks out there who are trying to move into the tech industry and don't have that very traditional background. What are some of the things you found important and helpful for you in both adapting to the tech industry from a less traditional background, but then also that you were able to bring with you that have been advantageous?
Yeah. I mean, I think I was lucky, for one, that sort of about towards the end of my linguistics degree was when the floodgates were kind of opening on jobs in natural language processing. There had been stuff before, but now you are really seeing kind of companies across the board pushing this language stuff really into their products. And before it had been a little bit more limited and a bit more thought experimenty, and now it was real. And so there was this great opportunity because I was like, I know about linguistics. I like coding. I have kind of my wedge into the industry because people are actually looking for this specific thing. I don't think that is necessarily available to everyone, but one thing you can see in the tech industry is that it kind of touches everything. There's tech for name your industry, tech for sales, tech for real estate, tech for, you name it. And even though not all hiring managers might be in the mindset that it helps to have someone with domain expertise about the product that is non-technical to come in and be a technical contributor, a lot are. And even if they're not, as long as you have kind of the technical skill set you need, I think you'll just generally find you're able to contribute in more ways than just writing code. Because you can be that translator between kind of the business side with a certain expertise and the technical side with a different expertise. You'll have much better intuitions about what users are going to need. So like one thing that was useful about having a linguistics degree is that a lot of folks who don't say, well, people will never say X, Y, Z. Or if I was going to ask Google to give me a pancake recipe, I would say make a pancake recipe. I would never say recipe time pancake day, but somebody might say that. And what you are trained in quite a bit in linguistics is, the vast variety of things that people might say and the numerous ways there are to express the same meaning and why you might do it in all these different ways. And what you get really good at is someone says, nobody ever says blah, blah, blah. And you're like, well, if you were a tiny person inside of a pumpkin and you can come up with a scenario in which it would make sense to say that thing. And so, but often, if you have this like expertise in sort of something else about the industry, you can come up with those edge cases that if you don't, or those kind of gotchas or trade secrets that someone who's only trained on the technical side won't have. And that can be true also of, an experience. If you were a stay-at-home parent, there's quite a few tech companies that are trying to do things for parents or children. And I think that, that occupation is maybe not as valued culturally as it should be. But there is a lot of value in it. And you're going to bring experience about the potential users of that that other folks might not have. I mean, even, being a stay-at-home parent versus being a working parent, there's whatever kind of category you're in, you have a set of experiences that's going to be useful for whatever it is you're building.
I love that. Okay, moving more in the management direction. You are very thoughtful about how you approach management. I saw that firsthand. And I know you were thinking about a couple of pieces of this that I'd love to dig into. So the first one I want to talk about is team dynamics.
Hmm.
How do you make a team really feel like a team?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way that I think about it is that on a very basic level, this is just a group of people. And what are the things that make groups of people get along? Like, if you go to a party, are there things that the host can do that's going to make it more likely that it's an enjoyable party and you kind of all talk with each other and you have a good time? Um, so, not to say that work is a party every day, but to some extent, as the manager, you are a little bit the party host, who's trying to at least make people not go home and complain about how terrible it was. So, one thing I think about is just how I show up. That, I need to be sufficiently authoritative and confident, that people feel secure that I'm going to be able to tell them the right things to do and help them do that. But I don't have to be exclusively authoritative and confident and distant. So I try to make personal connections with people both one-on-one and in the group. So and this is, very dependent on your personality. I'm comfortable sharing, funny stories about what happened to me as maybe jumping off points to kind of talk to other people about what happened to them. For me, it's very natural to like be chatty in a meeting, and I almost have to pull it back and be like, okay, let's do work. But I do think it's important for you to be setting the stage if you want it to feel communal and where people have, that sense of community. People don't have to be friends in kind of the classic definition of friends, but you want kind of good feelings with each other. To sort of set that stage like, hey, we're a group of people. We're here. It's a little bit funny. Like, it's a bit contrived that we all ended up having to be pseudo friends and do a project together. But now we're here, so let's just act like people. So I think that for me is the first stage. And then the second stage is, I think, really trying to understand each person and how they might want to belong to the community. So some people really like to talk and share. Some people don't want to do it as much. I think in general, it's good for everybody to be talking and sharing a little. And this is both kind of on the social side, but also on the technical side, because as from what I've seen, if someone is really always quiet, except for probably a pretty slim set of people, they're probably not feeling like they belong. And so it's about creating the right opportunities, both kind of opportunities for the people who are just naturally talkers to just kind of lead and do that, and opportunities where it feels really safe for everybody to talk. So, the go around the room thing is great if you want everybody to talk, but you need to be very sure that it's something everyone's going to be comfortable about. And so it's not, I would never say like, everyone go around the room and tell me your biggest fear, or like everyone go around the room and tell me your biggest accomplishment, or anything that's super personal. But maybe like, everyone go around the room, and actually one that was a hit was like, tell me if you would have a rat for a pet, or you kind of think that's weird. Everyone's going to have an opinion on that. And it is unlikely. I now, as I was saying, there's edge cases. I can imagine a reason why someone might have really strong feelings about rats that is not comfortable to share in a work environment, or maybe if you're like an exterminator. So I don't know, but there's kind of things that are fun but are pretty safe. And then I think the other piece of that is there's different ways that people like to contribute. So some people are like pretty verbal. I'm one of them. I'm chatty. Some people, that's not how they like to think, and that's not what they're always comfortable with in a group setting. So having a lot of, opportunities for written communication. If you're doing a brainstorm, I definitely recommend having people write things first and then potentially optionally share out loud what they wrote. And then, one more thing I think about is, what is the mission of the team or the project, and how do you get everyone to feel like they're really contributing to that? Because that is sort of ultimately the thing that's going to bind this group together. So, when I was building up my last team at Humu, we started with 5 of us. I think we got 5 more in a pretty short period of time. And also in that period of time, we were going towards this beta release of the project we were working on. And it was a pretty new kind of launch for us to do. We didn't do kind of these staged releases with a beta release in the past. So it was new and exciting, a lot of work. And the thing that everyone was talking about, on our team especially, that this was like the big focus, every conversation, something about the beta release. And so to me, it was important that everyone on the team, including the people who just joined, were part of that, so that it felt like this was this great opportunity where everyone can hit a milestone together and kind of celebrate and kind of go from there feeling like we are the team because we accomplished this. And so this isn't necessarily what I would always do, but in that circumstance, for when I was bringing on new people, it was like every week, and it was maybe the last person joined maybe only a couple weeks or 3 weeks before the launch. I wanted their starter task to be something that was related to this release. Maybe not for a lot of people. I was like, what is an extra feature? We said it wasn't required. It'd be cool if it was there, but if they don't finish it in time, it's not a big deal. But give people those tasks so that once we had this release and we had the celebration, it was like every person on this team was part of it and can sort of authentically celebrate and feel like they're part of this event that happens. And I think that worked really well to bring everyone together, because after that, we all were the team that built this thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that. Awesome. Now, one of the things I saw with that rapid growth is you were starting to train a couple of new managers as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would imagine, having just been through that, it's very fresh in your head, the challenges that new managers have. What were the biggest challenge you saw them have? Or what was the biggest challenge you saw them have?
I think something that's really hard for new managers is calibrating your expectations of what should and is likely to happen. I remember when I first started managing and I had to go, actually it was when I managed an intern, then I had to do their evaluation at the end. And I felt so unmoored from any sense of what an intern should do, because this was my first one. I hadn't been an intern. My kind of experience up to that point was pretty unique and maybe not analogous to what a lot of the interns had done. And it was just like, I thought they did a good job, but I don't know if they did a good enough job or way better than expected for whatever this bar is that I just really don't have a good sense of. And that's specifically a performance evaluation. For some people, that's like, I came to a company and I immediately kind of got in my head what all the levels are, and I off the bat can evaluate people. So it's not necessarily that, but there's just like how long to expect someone to take to ramp up. That was a really hard one for my new managers, because they've never done that. They never ramped someone up before. And I think to kind of understand ramp up, you need to have managed someone who you ramped up for maybe 1 or more years to see kind of the full arc to expect between new and truly ramped up. And if you haven't done that, you might see them kind of on this part of the arc and you're like, how are they going to get over here? But if you have done it, you've seen that there's usually kind of like this. They haven't, this is an audio format. There's ups and downs and different rates of growth kind of throughout maybe 6 months to a year before they're truly fully on board, especially an entry-level person. So coaching new managers on how to deal with this and sort of just the patience both to let someone figure it out and to let someone struggle a little bit as they're figuring it out. Those are things that are kind of hard to get used to because they're pretty uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable to have someone who you need to keep coaching every time for them to really get what they need to do. And that if someone is really new to tech, that is very likely what is going to happen, just because they're figuring it out. And then it's also hard to watch that person really struggle with a task that's very easy for you, and you could step in and be like, do it this way, because you're both, waiting for it to get done, and you kind of watch someone in some emotional turmoil as they're trying to do this thing, and having the patience to just let that happen, because they were going to learn from that turmoil, and also reminding yourself, which was something that was really hard for me as a new manager, that actually my direct reports did not expect every day at work to be the most joyous day of their life, or they didn't expect that they were going to come to work and never struggle with anything. And I was like, they're struggling. I did it wrong. This is supposed to be summer camp, and they're supposed to be so happy and hitting all these milestones and feeling amazing all the time. And then I realized, like, I wasn't mad at my manager when I had trouble with a task. I just tried to figure out how to do it. And so, yeah, I think kind of just like calibrating yourself to how people are going to behave, what the problems are they're going to have, and how long it's going to take for certain things to happen is really hard until you've just kind of been in it for a while.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Are there any concrete tactics or mindset shifts or things that you would recommend to folks who are struggling with that transition?
I mean, on the calibration piece, I think, don't be afraid to ask people who've been in it for longer what they would expect. And I think to have patience with yourself. If you became a manager, it's probably because you were pretty good at some things up until that point. And those things affected people because you were working with people, they were technical, but they didn't directly probably affect people in quite the way that your actions affect your direct reports when you're a manager. Suddenly, you're kind of the main outside force beyond what's happening inside the individual in someone's career. You can push them forward in ways that might have a lot to do with their personal finances, which feels really risky, or their kind of long-term career path, or what industry they end up in. And that feels like a lot of responsibility. So if you combine like this new responsibility that can feel way more high pressure than what you've done before, and you've gotten used, at least lately, to doing everything you do quite well, it's really hard to suddenly deal with the fact that now you're going to do some things that feel really high stakes, not as well. And you're probably going to be fine, but you're not going to be great in that way you expect. And there'll be some things that if you were you're probably going to be great at immediately. But I think being patient with yourself about those things and understanding that for every new manager, there's some amount of trial and error that happens. And it is like uncomfortable that you're a little bit trial and error on a human subject, but they are an adult person who also can understand that. Like, you're in this relationship that's this management relationship that's kind of this thing that someone decided existed in this hierarchical fashion at this company. So you kind of really start thinking about those roles all the time, but you're actually just these two people. And you can, if you remind yourself you're just two people, and what you might expect your friend to be accommodating of if you were having a problem, it gets a little bit less scary. And keeping in mind that it is different. It also is different from a friend because you do have this power, so you shouldn't assume they're just your friend and they can deal with you having a bad day and yelling in the way that maybe a best friend can. But I think it is just accepting that you're going to make those mistakes and having the mindset that it's not great. I don't feel amazing having made a mistake, but it is perfectly reasonable and even expected that this would happen. And now I don't have to make that mistake multiple times. Or maybe you have to make it multiple times, but eventually you will stop making it once you've kind of figured it out.
Yeah. So something you said there made me think, because you were talking about, management kind of being this constructed hierarchical thing. Mm-hmm. And earlier in our conversation, you were talking about management is like being the party host. You're setting up the party. And I think there's, different people think about the goals of management in different ways. do you have a mental model of how you think about like what management is and how it fits into work?
Yeah, and I also think that every manager has a slightly different mental model. So I think the first thing is in our society we've kind of decided over years in a historical context that I don't actually know very much about, but I'm pretty sure it happened, that there are companies, that these companies have these hierarchies by which they are run, that there's certain things that happen, that's usually a tree-shaped hierarchy in some sense, that the different nodes in the tree probably control the income of the other nodes in the tree and the work that the other nodes do. And there's just sort of, that is how we are organized. I don't know exactly how we got there. Some of it's probably the vagaries of history had something to do with maybe how people wanted to run a factory, which is not quite the same as like running a tech company, but hey, now we have 8-hour workdays. Some of it might be because that's kind of the most natural or efficient way for people to do things. But it is just sort of this thing that we kind of have agreed to in our society that exists. There's these hierarchies, people operate in them, but is to some extent made up. And not made up spuriously, but made up over years of making up how we were going to get things done. And at least kind of in, the society and culture I'm in, it's kind of except for maybe like certain types of clubs, it's kind of the only thing in your life that's structured that way. A lot of the rest of your life is a lot less hierarchical. There's kind of mini hierarchies, but in the way that you're interacting with people in your family or close circle, it might not, it doesn't at least have that exact structure. And so I think that the other piece is it's made up, but it's incredibly real. And especially the part where these different nodes control the income of the nodes below them. That is very real, and that is a huge amount of power. And you probably control it to different extents depending on how your company is set up, but even if you don't directly control someone's income, the opportunities you give them, the exposure you give them, the treatment that you give them, the way you talk about them to your superiors, all affects that person's, life and finances in a real way. So I think as a manager, I think there's a way to think my goal and everyone's goal is to kind of climb the nodes in the hierarchy and extract the maximum income from those nodes. And there's a management style that will do that. There's a management style where you just do that by yourself. There's a management style where you try to bring those people up with you, and maybe that helps push you up even further. But I think that kind of ignores the human element that we're going to work every day. We have to talk to these people every day. It's a huge part of our lives. And it's actually just like a lot less crappy if those are good, positive relationships and you are treating people kindly. And so one of maybe, as I'm talking this through, I think the one way I think about this as my role is I have been granted a certain amount of power. How in the context of having that power and being in this particular structure and hierarchy, do I treat people kindly? And that is, to me, by giving them kind of the maximum opportunity and making work as positive as I reasonably can, while still contributing to the goal that everybody in this hierarchy or in this organization has decided to move towards. I will say that's a lot easier if you and everyone in the organization think that's a good goal and think that's something worth doing in the world. But in any case, so, how can I organize the people I'm responsible for to make progress in service of this goal? Part of the goal is make money. How can I make money and do whatever the hopefully good thing is I'm trying to do in the world, and set these people under me up for success, both while they're working for me and in a way that once I'm not there and we're all in a different hierarchy and a different structure, they have the skills to both, operate successfully in that structure and be kind. Um, and I think that that's just one way of thinking about management. I think most people think about management in some sense of mentorship, although not probably 100% of managers. But mentorship can mean a lot of different things depending on what you're trying to mentor somebody to do. Um, and I think, for me, it's how can I make it possible for these people to succeed and also be kind in a way that makes the organization a more positive organization.
Yeah. Well, and what makes this really tricky is kind of what you alluded to earlier. The best way to set people up for success isn't always to keep them from struggling.
Yeah.
Right? Struggle is necessary for growth.
Right. Right. And I think to me, there's sort of a threshold at which the struggle is too much for someone and it is not helpful to anyone, especially that person. If someone is getting really burnt out, really exhausted, really demotivated, um, it's hard to articulate what that threshold is, but you kind of know it when you see it. Like, this isn't positive growth anymore. This is just a person having a really shitty time. It's okay for people to have a slightly shitty time because that's how life is, and we can learn from those or overcome them, or they're just like if I had a way to make life never shitty for someone, I would be a bazillionaire because I would get people to pay me a lot of money to make their lives never shitty. Um, but but when things start to really seem bleak for someone, that's actually too extreme. It shouldn't get to the point of being bleak. It's just when someone's really suffering. When it changes from struggle to suffering, you need to intervene, and ideally, instead of intervening, you just prevented it from ever getting there.
I love that. Okay. One more topic to talk about. If you're okay, if it's public that you're going into a new company, I'd love to hear how you're thinking about entering a new organization as a leader.
Yeah, so I guess it can be public. I haven't posted on LinkedIn, but probably by the time this goes anywhere, it will be on LinkedIn. So I am joining a tiny startup called Kismet Health as the head of engineering. There are currently 4 employees. Once I join tomorrow, it will be 5 employees of this company. Right now, that's me and one other engineer. We'll probably, it's going to be small for a while because we're at a very early stage. And this is a different thing than I've ever done. I've always come into something where there's a lot more existing structure and a lot more people. And often when you come into that situation, your first thing you have to do as a manager is kind of understand what it is that is there, and how you can best operate within, kind of this existing ecosystem of people that's already kind of chugging along at whatever it's doing. And so this is a little different, but in another sense, it's not that different because I don't yet know really like what is the right structure for this future engineering team, what is the right management style for the people who are on the team. And the first thing I think I'm thinking about doing is I just need to get to know everybody, especially, the other engineers I'll be working with, and what they're excited about and what they need and what their past experiences have been. And kind of get to understand more about the product and the project. What's the pace that we need to be sustainably going at? What are the real priorities? Like what's in this product? What's most important? There's products where it's important to kind of keep pushing out features because that's what users are really going to want. There's products where it's important you only have a few features, but it's really about quality. I mean, there's all different types of things that can be important, and those things will help me understand how do I structure this team. So I feel like I have almost no plans at this point because it's hard to plan until you really understand what it is you're trying to do.
Makes sense. All right. Well, we've covered a lot of ground. Are there any topics that we didn't cover that you'd like to talk about?
This is a short one, but it's about communication. Um, what I found coaching folks is that they often under communicate, and it's usually because they don't want to be annoying. um, and so it feels like if every time you post something in Slack, it's this long thing with all these explanations, and then you're posting it over and over, and you're also paying individuals about it. Like that might not be something you would do in your regular life with your friends or your spouse. They might get very annoyed because they'd be like, I already know this. I already figured it out. Don't explain it to me every time. And yes, you told me that I need to mail this thing and I'm going to do it. Don't tell me every day. But work is a different situation. And I think the key thing about that situation is everybody is very busy and kind of distracted by these other things they need to do. And also, usually, I mean, there's times when you're just individually paying someone, but more often you're throwing information into a channel or area where people can see it. It might not jump out as number one important thing, and it's also maybe a little less annoying. And so I think having the confidence to say the same thing multiple times in a way that's really going to catch people's attention and make it really, really clear what's happening, you kind of have to push yourself to do it once as you're getting used to that. But it's very helpful for everyone because as someone who has been at work and been very busy, it can take someone reminding me in different channels of something, up to 3 times before I'm like, oh, this is the thing and I need to do this about it. So don't be afraid to over communicate. If you're annoying people, someone will tell you.
All right, that's it for this Human Skills interview. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking this video and subscribing to this channel. You can also subscribe to the Human Skills newsletter, which there's a link to right down below, to get notified of interviews like this as they come out. Take care, y'all. This is K-Ball signing out.